Okay, DVC Youth, we are actually getting close to finishing the whole book of Jonah now. We are going to be getting into Jonah chapter 4, which is the last chapter of Jonah, and it's only 11 verses. So after today, we're almost halfway through with the last chapter of Jonah. So we are making our way through here. Again, if you've not seen the other videos or listened to them, please go back and do so. So not only you hopefully are encouraged and challenged, but so you know what's going on in this video. Okay, so quick overview. Just remember, right before this passage we're about to get into, right before this, Jonah has finally obeyed God, gone to Nineveh, and has preached to them. And Nineveh has responded to Jonah positively, like immediately. They're repenting. Everyone's repenting. The king, servants, men, women, animals, like everyone is repenting of their evil, okay, and their sin before God. So now in verse 10, we're going to see what God does in light of their repentance. Okay, verse 10. When God saw their deeds, meaning talking about Nineveh's repentance, that they turned from their wicked way, then God relented concerning the calamity which he had declared he would bring upon them. And he did not do it. Okay, so let me put some question marks here. Sorry, it's blue, so you can't see it super well. Relented, calamity, kind of fancy words going on. What does this mean? That God relented concerning the calamity. So to relent when referring to God means that God is not going through with the judgment that he said he was going to do. And remember, he had said this through Jonah. And that's what calamity means, judgment here. He's talking about the judgment that God had prophesied he was going to do because of Nineveh's wickedness and their sin. But because they have repented, God relents, okay? So that's what's going on there. God is showing grace, compassion, mercy to the wicked, really evil Ninevites, the enemies of Israel, okay? And God is showing, we'll put some hearts there, compassion to them. So right after this, beginning of chapter 4 now, verse 1 down here, we're going to start seeing Jonah's reaction to God's action, okay? Verse 1, but it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord and said, please, Lord, was this not what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish. And forestall here means to just like to keep from happening. In order to stop this from happening, I fled to Tarshish. For I knew, this is what Jonah knew about God. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity, which is what he just did, right? He relented concerning calamity. And that Jonah knows that this is the type of God he is. And hopefully, when you see this word here, loving kindness, we talk about this all the time in youth. Okay, so what Hebrew word is this term translating? Okay, we talk about it is a really important word in the Old Testament, talking about God's character. It's the word chesed, right? Let me type it out for you here. And the H has got some phlegm on it. Chesed, okay? Chesed is loving kindness, grace, mercy, covenant faithfulness, loyal love. There's all these different ways to translate it, and it basically we don't have an English word that properly does justice to chesed, the type of loyal love, compassionate mercy that God shows, and who God is. Okay, so that's what that word is. And Jonah knows that this is who God is, that he is a God of chesed. He's compassionate, he's gracious, he's slow to anger, and he relents concerning judgment. Okay, and in verse 3, he says, therefore, now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life. And then the Lord said, do you have good reason to be angry? Okay, kind of a leading question there. But again, here in verses 1, 2, and 3, we finally, from Jonah's own mouth, we finally know why he has been running and disobedient to God. Okay, we had little hints throughout the story as to why, but now Jonah just straight up says it. He has been running from God because he knew the type of God that God is, that he's a God of chesed, of compassion, of grace, and that he knew if he went to Nineveh in obedience to what God said, that this would happen, that God would forgive them. And that is exactly what happens. Jonah's right? And he is really, really angry. Okay? Remember, because the Ninevites are the enemies of Israel, and they're really a wicked people. So Jonah, again, in verse 3, we see a super sharp distinction or juxtaposition, right? This comparison between Jonah and Jesus. Jonah, in chapter 3, he's telling God to kill him, right? Jonah, again, would rather die than God show mercy to his enemies. And Jesus does die willingly in order that God is able to show mercy, compassion to his enemies, to us, right? So Jonah and Jesus are like complete opposites throughout the story. And we finally, the narrator has shown us Jonah's heart in the matter. Okay, so let me clear all of this and go to a couple questions. Oops, there we go. Okay, now, it's easy to judge Jonah, and granted, I've been doing that throughout the video, okay, showing, and that's what the author of the story is showing us, how Jonah is acting wrongly almost all the time, right? But Jonah makes sense, right? He makes sense. And what I mean by this is the Ninevites, the Assyrian, like they're part of the Assyrian Empire. This is a really powerful empire next to Israel. They do not worship God. They worship false gods, other gods. They are really prone to violence, and really they do a lot of evil things. Okay, so Jonah, he knows that Assyria, Nineveh, the Ninevites are a threat to Israel, to God's covenant people, and to God's covenant promises to Israel. So I know I'm being hard on Jonah, but in the end, like according to our own wisdom, Jonah's own wisdom, like it makes sense that he would not want God to save the enemies of Israel. Okay? So I want you to think about who are some real or maybe hypothetical, like future enemies that you would you would or you do struggle with God showing mercy to, right? That you think about this person and it's like, God, ultimately, I don't want you showing mercy to them, you know? Like if you honestly think about that. And this is a real struggle, right? This is God's grace, God's love does not make sense according to human wisdom. Okay? God dies for his enemies. That doesn't make sense. All right? God through Jesus, the incarnate Son, dies for his enemies. That makes zero sense to us according to our own wisdom. But that's the kind of love God shows us, and that's the kind of love we're called to show other people. But I want you to think about this. Who are some real or hypothetical enemies that you, like Jonah, struggle with this? Okay. Second question. Jonah believes that Nineveh does not deserve God's chesed. So I want you to think about that statement and what's ironic and fundamentally wrong about this, okay? And then the last question, I actually want to read a quote from one of my favorite authors and pastors, Tim Keller, from his book, The Prodigal Prophet. It's actually a short little book about Jonah. It's fantastic. This is a quote here I want to read, and then I want to go back to this last question, okay? Jonah's love of his people had become bigotry. Or love of his people meaning Israel, right? Jonah's love of Israel had become bigotry. And now, without the hope that Israel would win in this international power struggle, his life had lost all meaning. As long as serving God fit into his goals for Israel, he was fine with God. As soon as he had to choose between the true God and the God he actually worshiped, he turned on the true God in anger. Jonah's particular national identity was more foundational to his self-worth than his role as a servant of the God of all the nations. The real God had been just a means to an end. He was using God to serve his real God. Okay, that's deep, powerful quote. So if you want to pause the screen and look at that a couple times and reflect on that, and then go to this last question, okay? Am I using God as a means to worship another God? And if so, what or who is that God? Okay, so I want you to take time to think about that and to pray through that. Love you guys so much, and miss you, and looking forward to start getting together with some little events coming up.